Theme 3. The Third Republic before 1914. A political regime and a colonial empire. Chapter 1. A regime born of defeat. The collapse of the Second Empire in 1870 marks a decisive turning point in French history. Everything changes after the crushing defeat of the French army at the Battle of Sedan, when Napoleon III himself is captured by Prussian forces. With the emperor taken prisoner, the imperial regime suddenly collapses. Already weakened by the disastrous war against Prussia, Napoleon III is forced into exile in England, where he will spend the final years of his life before dying a few years later. This dramatic moment brings an end to nearly 20 years of authoritarian rule in France and plunges the country into a period of profound political upheaval. On 4 September 1870, as Paris stands under siege from Prussian troops, Republican deputies, among them Léon Gambetta and Jules Favre, gather at the Paris City Hall and proclaim the Republic. At that moment, a new chapter in French history begins. The establishment of a republican regime with its own distinctive features and the continued expansion of France's colonial empire. Let us now turn to one of the most striking figures of this dramatic moment, Léon Gambetta. Serving as Minister of the Interior in the Provisional Government, Gambetta plays a central role in organizing the resistance of a country shaken by defeat. But Paris is surrounded by Prussian forces. Determined to continue the struggle, Gambetta must escape the encirclement of the capital. In October 1870, he leaves Paris in a way that will soon become legendary by balloon. Accompanied by his close friend Eugène Spuller, he rises into the sky aboard the balloon Armand Barbès, flying over enemy lines while Prussian troops fire from below. His objective is clear: to reach the government delegation established in Tours and organize the national defense from the provinces. Meanwhile, the war profoundly weakens France and transforms the balance of power in Europe. After the Prussian victory, the German states unite under the leadership of Chancellor Bismarck. On 18 January 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, William I of Prussia is proclaimed German emperor. The choice of Versailles is highly symbolic. For the Germans, it represents a form of revenge for the humiliations inflicted in earlier centuries by Louis XIV and later by Napoleon I. This moment marks the proclamation of the German Reich, and it permanently disrupts the balance of power in Europe. Yet, while these events are transforming the balance of power in Europe, another drama is unfolding inside France itself. The defeat and the capitulation provoke a deep social and political crisis, particularly in Paris. Tension rises in the capital, and soon it explodes. In March 1871, a popular and revolutionary uprising breaks out, the Paris Commune. For 72 dramatic days, Paris is governed by the communards. They oppose the conservative government that is withdrawn to Versailles, and they attempt to establish a new political experiment, a form of direct and social democracy. Among the most emblematic figures of the Commune stands Louise Michel, a committed school teacher, and a woman who openly identifies as an anarchist. Through her actions and her speeches, she embodies the struggle for the emancipation of women and of the working classes. Her dedication to education and her constant fight for social justice will leave a lasting mark on French collective memory. Nevertheless, the story of the Commune does not end with this revolutionary experiment. It ends in tragedy. Its final days are remembered under a chilling name: the Bloody Week. This term refers to the period from 21 to 28 May 1871, when the army of Versailles, loyal to the government of Adolphe Thiers, recaptures Paris from the communards and brutally brings the Paris Commune to an end. The repression is accompanied by extreme violence, and the city becomes the scene of fierce fighting and reprisals. A few days before the final collapse of the Commune, another dramatic episode takes place at La Roquette prison. 6 hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris, Monsignor Darboy, are executed by supporters of the Commune in retaliation for the repression carried out by the troops of Versailles. Then, on 26 May, the violence intensifies further. 50 other hostages are shot on Rue Haxo, in an atmosphere dominated by fear and despair. When the communards are finally defeated, the repression does not stop. It continues through summary executions, mass arrests, swift trials, and deportations. The exact number of victims remains debated by historians. Estimates range from 5,700 to 20,000 deaths, people killed in combat, executed after the fighting, or who later die from their wounds. This tragic episode, marked by the brutality of both sides, leaves a deep imprint on French social and political history. Over time, the Paris Commune becomes a powerful symbol for revolutionary movements. In the 20th century, it even inspires the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution of 1917, who see in it the first attempt to establish what they call a dictatorship of the proletariat. Today, one place in Paris still embodies the memory of those events. The Wall of the Federates, located in Père Lachaise Cemetery, marks the spot where 147 communards were shot by the Versailles Army on 27 or 28 May 1871, at the very end of the Bloody Week. Executed without trial, their bodies were thrown into a mass grave. Over time, this wall becomes a powerful symbol of the brutal repression of the Paris Commune. It is now a place of memory and of political remembrance, where people gather every year to commemorate the victims and reflect on struggles for social justice. The wall visible today has been reconstructed, but it still preserves original elements and memorial plaques recalling the massacre. Yet, after these tragic events, France must now rebuild its political institutions and redefine the nature of its regime. The Third Republic is proclaimed in a context of turmoil and struggles to establish itself amid rising political tensions. Executive power is initially entrusted to Adolphe Thiers, the same political leader whose government had directed the repression of the Commune from Versailles. Thiers is far from being a newcomer to political life. He has long been a familiar figure to the French, already prominent during the July Monarchy, and later active under the Second Empire. He has for decades occupied an important place in the political life of the country. His experience and reputation make him one of the best-known statesmen of his time, a man whose name is widely recognized by the French public. Now faced with the immense challenges of 1871, Thiers must attempt to restore order in a country deeply divided by defeat and civil conflict. At the same time, he must negotiate peace with the newly unified German Empire. However, the Republic quickly encounters strong opposition within Parliament. A conservative majority dominates the assembly, and among them, many monarchists still hope to restore the monarchy. These monarchists continue to hold considerable political influence, making the future of the Republican regime far from certain. Following the fragile consolidation of the Third Republic, the political landscape continued to evolve. Marshal MacMahon, elected president of the Republic in 1873, came to embody the conservative trend that still lingered in French politics. Yet, by 1877, the Republicans had managed to secure a parliamentary majority. Then, the very same year, President MacMahon, attempting to assert the supremacy of the executive over the newly empowered Republican majority, triggered a significant institutional crisis on 16 May. However, strong public mobilization and the decisive Republican victory in the legislative elections forced him to yield. Ultimately, he resigned 2 years later, marking a definitive turning point. This episode put an end to the hopes of a monarchical restoration and confirmed the lasting dominance of Republicans in French political life. The definitive arrival of the Republicans in power in 1879 marked a decisive turning point in the history of the Third Republic. After several years of instability and monarchist dominance, the Republicans firmly established themselves at the head of the state. This shift was made possible in particular by President McMahon's forced resignation and by Republican victories in both the legislative and senatorial elections. From that moment onward, they undertook to consolidate the regime and to anchor Republican values deeply within French society. Republican symbols played a central role in this process of consolidation. In 1880, July 14th became the national holiday, commemorating both the storming of the Bastille and the Festival of the Federation. At the same time, the tricolor flag was officially established as the national emblem. Marianne, the allegorical figure of the Republic, embodied the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. She appeared in town halls, on postage stamps, and during major official ceremonies, constantly recalling the country's democratic and secular ideals. The Pantheon, for its part, was reaffirmed as a site of Republican memory, honoring the great men and women who had shaped the history of France. Education became one of the central pillars of the Republican project. The school laws introduced by Jules Ferry, passed in 1881 and 1882, established free, secular, and compulsory primary education for children aged 6 to 13. These reforms aimed to train enlightened citizens capable of participating in democratic life. They also sought to free society from the influence of the church. Secular schooling thus became the crucible of national identity and the main vehicle for spreading Republican values. Secularism, a fundamental value of the Republic, was firmly established with the law on the separation of churches and the state of 9 December 1905. This law proclaimed freedom of conscience and guaranteed the free exercise of religious worship. It also established the principle of state neutrality in religious matters. It brought an end to the Concordat system and marked the culmination of the secularization of French society. Civil liberties were also central to this Republican consolidation. The law of 29 July 1881 on freedom of the press abolished prior censorship and established a particularly liberal framework for the publication and circulation of newspapers. In 1901, the law on freedom of association allowed the creation and operation of associations without prior authorization. This reform encouraged the development of civil society and strengthened democratic debate. Despite these advances, the Third Republic went through several major crises. The Boulanger Affair, during which General Georges Boulanger, supported by a populist and nationalist movement in the 1880s, threatened the regime by fueling nationalist passions and raising the possibility of a coup d'etat. 3 years later, President of the Republic Sadi Carnot was assassinated by an anarchist. At the end of the 19th century, French society was deeply divided, and the Republican principles of justice and equality were put to the test. These crises, overcome through the mobilization of citizens and institutions, ultimately strengthened the Republican foundations and the legitimacy of the regime. In this context, the Dreyfus Affair was the major judicial and political crisis of the Third Republic. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish staff officer of Alsatian origin, was arrested on 15 October 1894 for high treason, suspected of having delivered military secrets to Germany. The accusation was based on a memorandum discovered at the German embassy and attributed to Dreyfus solely because of a supposed similarity in handwriting. He was convicted a few weeks later without serious evidence. publicly degraded on 5 January 1895 inches Paris during a humiliating ceremony, and then deported to a penal colony in French Guiana, Theodor Herzl, who witnessed the degradation, was deeply affected by the violent anti-Semitic insults shouted by the crowd, "Death to the Jews!" He concluded that the assimilation of Jews in Europe was illusory, which led him to found the Zionist movement by publishing the Jewish State in 1896 and organizing the First World Zionist Congress in 1897. He later stated, "The Dreyfus trial made me a Zionist." The affair took on national significance when Émile Zola published, in January 1898, in the newspaper L'Aurore, his famous open letter, J'accuse, in which he denounced the injustice of the conviction and the anti-Semitism of the military high command. This text caused a major shock in public opinion. Zola was prosecuted, convicted, and forced into exile. At the time, Georges Clemenceau was the director of L'Aurore and wrote nearly 700 articles in support of a retrial. Thanks to these efforts, Dreyfus was officially rehabilitated in 1906. Chapter 2. An Imperial Republic. The construction and justification of the colonial empire. Certainly, the Third Republic experienced major social advances at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, and these developments endured, despite crises that could have shaken the regime. However, other dynamics were also at work, in particular, the construction of a colonial empire. From the 1870s, 1880s, the Third Republic actively revived French colonial expansion, which had already begun under the monarchy. With the conquest of Algeria in 1830, France engaged in an international competition with the United Kingdom and Germany for control of territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. In this context of colonization and the scramble for Africa, the colonial empire became a symbol of national power. The accusation was based on a memorandum discovered at the German embassy and attributed to Dreyfus solely because of a supposed similarity in handwriting. He was convicted a few weeks later, without serious evidence, publicly degraded on 5 January 1895 inches Paris during a humiliating ceremony, and then deported to a penal colony in French Guiana. Theodor Herzl, who witnessed the degradation, was deeply affected by the violent anti-Semitic insults shouted by the crowd, "Death to the Jews!" He concluded that the assimilation of Jews in Europe was illusory, which led him to found the Zionist movement by publishing the Jewish State in 1896 and organizing the First World Zionist Congress in 1897. He later stated, "The Dreyfus trial made me a Zionist." The affair took on national significance when Émile Zola published, in January 1898, in the newspaper L'Aurore, his famous open letter, J'accuse, in which he denounced the injustice of the conviction and the anti-Semitism of the military high command. This text caused a major shock in public opinion. Zola was prosecuted, convicted, and forced into exile. At the time, Georges Clemenceau was the director of L'Aurore and wrote nearly 700 articles in support of a retrial. Thanks to these efforts, Dreyfus was officially rehabilitated in 1906. Colonization was also driven by economic interests. Colonies were expected to supply raw materials to French industry and offer new commercial markets. French colonial expansion mainly affected Africa and Asia. In Africa, Algeria, conquered from 1830 onwards, became the main European settler territory. French West Africa, AOF, grouped 8 colonies in West Africa: Mauritania, Senegal, French Sudan, now Mali, French Guinea, Ivory Coast, Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, Dahomey, now Benin, and Niger. After firmly consolidating its republican institutions and promoting social and educational reforms, France also turned its attention to expanding its influence abroad. This ambition led to the creation of French Equatorial Africa, a vast territory in Central Africa, Gabon, French Congo, Ubangi Shari, Chad. While French Equatorial Africa represented the Republic's main presence in Central Africa, France simultaneously extended its influence to the Indian Ocean. During this period, the French undertook the conquest of the place-dented Comoros, strategically located islands controlling maritime routes, Djibouti, at the entrance to the Red Sea, and Madagascar, a large island rich in resources and with a significant population. In Asia, French Indochina comprised several territories: Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, gradually conquered between 1858 and 1907. At the same time, France established two protectorates in North Africa, Tunisia, and Morocco. In Morocco, the territory was shared with Spain, while Germany showed ambitions and sought to assert its influence in the region. As France expanded its colonial ambitions in Africa, it was not alone in this race for territories. Other European powers were also actively pursuing colonies. It became necessary to formalize rules for claiming African powers' lands. The Berlin Conference took place from November 15, 1884 to the 26th of February, 1885. Initiated by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, it brought together the main European powers, as well as the United States, to regulate colonization and trade in Africa. Its primary goal was to establish rules for the division of the African continent, notably imposing the principle of effective occupation. A power could only claim African territory if it exercised actual administration there. The conference also guaranteed freedom of navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers, as well as free trade within the Congo Basin. While adopting a declaration against the slave trade, no African representatives were invited to the negotiations, which resulted in an arbitrary division of the continent, largely responsible for current borders and many subsequent conflicts. French colonization relied on several types of actors, including the military, explorers, and colonial administrators. Among the military figures, Joseph Gallieni and Hubert Lyautey embodied the colonial officer role, acting as conquerors, administrators, and organizers. Gallieni notably distinguished himself in Madagascar, where he was appointed resident general in 1896, arriving in a context of insurrection. After the island had been conquered following 2 wars before his appointment, he applied a pacification method combining military force and political repression. Upon arrival, he established forced labor for the indigenous population, imposed surveillance over the royal court, and executed members of the Malagasy nobility, including the uncle of Queen Ranavalona III and her interior minister, to terrorize the population and crush any resistance. The queen herself was dethroned and exiled, marking the end of the local monarchy. Gallieni implemented the so-called policy of races, aimed at dividing ethnic groups to better control them, while developing infrastructure such as roads, schools, and railways to consolidate French domination. However, this pacification was accompanied by exceptionally brutal repression, summary executions, massacres of civilians, such as the Ambaki massacre, and systematic use of terror caused thousands of Malagasy deaths over 8 years. According to historical estimates, Hubert Lyautey, a disciple of Gallieni, applied and refined these methods in other territories, notably in Morocco. After serving in Indochina and Madagascar alongside Gallieni, Lyautey became the first resident general of Morocco in 1912. He implemented a oil spot policy, which involved gradually extending French influence while relying on local elites, developing infrastructure, and respecting Moroccan traditions and culture to some extent. Lyautey aimed to modernize the country while maintaining order, but his strategy remained a form of colonial domination, sometimes accompanied by repression, especially during tribal uprisings. Nevertheless, he is associated with a softer approach than Gallieni's, favoring dialogue and integration, while maintaining France's preeminence. In Asia, the colonization of Indochina began under Napoleon III with the annexation of Cochinchina in 1862, but it was under the Third Republic that it was strengthened and organized. From the 1880s, France imposed its protectorate over Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and later Laos, forming the Indo-Chinese Union in 1887. This domination relied on economic exploitation, authoritarian administration, and social inequalities, which quickly sparked resistance and the emergence of Vietnamese nationalism. While French colonization was often imposed through force and repression, some exceptions existed. Societies of geography and certain explorers adopted a different approach. Indeed, explorers played a key role in colonial expansion, exemplified by Pierre Savorgnan de Brazza. Italian-born, but naturalized French, was known for his peaceful approach. He negotiated treaties with local chiefs, such as King Makoko, and founded Brazzaville, laying the foundations of French Congo. Brazza positioned himself as a defender of local populations, opposing the brutality of some other colonizers, particularly regarding the issue of slavery. While some figures such as Pierre Savorgnan de Brazza denounced the excesses of violent colonization and sought a more humane approach, others in France defended colonial expansion as a moral and political duty. This contrast illustrates that colonization was both contested and justified. French colonization was justified by the ideology of the civilizing mission, according to which European peoples, particularly France, had the duty to spread civilization, culture, and republican values to populations considered inferior. Jules Ferry, a key figure of the Third Republic, defended this vision in his famous 1885 speech. It must be openly said that indeed superior races have a right over inferior races. They have the duty to civilize the inferior races. This mission was presented as a moral duty, meant to bring progress, peace, and modernity to the colonized peoples. The writer Victor Hugo shared this vision of colonization. In his speech on Africa on the 18th of May, 1879, he declared, "What a land this Africa is! Asia has its history. America has its history. Even Australia has its history. Africa has no history. A vast and obscure legend envelops it. In the 19th century, the white man made the black man a human being. In the 20th century, Europe will make Africa a world." Colonization was also driven by economic and strategic interests. Colonies were seen as sources of raw materials, cotton, rubber, minerals, essential to French industry, as well as markets for manufactured goods, they enabled France to strengthen its power on the international stage, competing with other major powers such as the United Kingdom and Germany. The presence of naval bases and footholds around the world seas was considered a major strategic asset for national defense and trade. French colonization was accompanied by policies fundamentally contrary to Republican values, based on inequality, racial discrimination, and repression. The indigenat system, established from 1,881 inches Algeria and then extended to all colonies, deprived indigenous populations of fundamental rights. It imposed arbitrary punishments without fair trials, and gave colonial administrators absolute power. Additionally, forced labor was widely practiced in the colonies, harshly exploiting indigenous labor to serve French interests. In July 1885, a debate took place in the Chamber of Deputies between Jules Ferry, defender of colonization, and Georges Clemenceau, his main opponent. Ferry justified colonial expansion for economic reasons, a civilizing mission based on racial hierarchy, and the restoration of national prestige. Clemenceau denounced the human and financial costs of conquests, criticized the priority given to the empire over social reforms, and rejected the racist ideology of superior races. This debate illustrated the strong ideological tensions provoked by colonization under the Third Republic. The labor movement also rose against the exploitation of colonial workers, denouncing working conditions and inequalities. These criticisms highlighted the paradox between the values proclaimed by the Republic and colonial practices, which often violated the fundamental rights of colonized peoples. Georges Clemenceau, 1885. No, there is no right of so-called superior nations over inferior nations. There is the struggle for life, which is a fatal necessity, that as we rise in civilization, we must contain within the limits of justice and law. But let us not try to cloak violence with the hypocritical name of civilization. Let us not speak of rights or duties. The conquest you advocate is the pure and simple abuse of force that scientific civilization wields over rudimentary civilizations to appropriate man. Torture him. Extract all the strength within him for the benefit of the oppressed. So-called civilizer. This is not a right, it is its negation. To speak of civilization in this context is to combine violence with hypocrisy. The Third Republic was built on a dual dynamic. In mainland France, it affirmed republican and humanist principles, popular sovereignty, fundamental freedoms, and free, secular, compulsory education. At the same time, it imposed in the colonies an authoritarian power based on violence, racism, and inequality. This contradiction revealed the limits of republican universalism. The proclaimed rights were reserved for metropolitan citizens, while denied to colonized peoples. This tension fueled deep debates on the civilizing mission, which claimed to legitimize colonization in the name of progress, while serving economic and strategic interests. It reflected a republic divided between its ideals and the reality of its imperial domination. In this context, the Republic School played a central role. Through Ernest Levis's textbooks, it transmitted a national memory focused on the defeat of 1870 and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. History became a tool of patriotism based on revenge. Levis wrote, "You must love France because nature made it beautiful, and history made it great." The Germans, sometimes called Alamans, named after one of the ancient barbarian Germanic peoples who defeated the Roman Empire, were depicted as hereditary enemies responsible for national humiliation. This image helped foster a sense of unity and pride, but also hatred and desire for revenge, preparing minds for the war that was soon to come.